is the one thing that no one wants to be called? About 18 or 19 years ago, I sat in a classroom as a new student pursuing my master's degree in counseling here at the University of Georgia. And the professor posed that question. And I thought about it for a minute. What is the one thing that no one wants to be called? Uncertain of what this particular question had to do with the course we were taking, we continued to toss out ideas. Answers included unmotivated, unintelligent, inadequate, unattractive. The list went on. It was obvious that we weren't providing the answer that the professor was looking for, and I was a bit lost, and I began to wonder, what kind of icebreaker is this? After listening to all of our answers intently, there was a pause, and the professor said, racist. No one wants to ever be called racist. Listen, I don't remember the discussion that followed, but I do remember not believing his answer. I remember doubting and not being convinced. But now, almost 20 years later, I found this to be true. We do not want to be called racist. In fact, we not only don't want to be called racist, we don't want our behaviors to be interpreted as such. And as a result, we simply avoid the topic of race altogether. There's a significant amount of emotional and mental energy and psychological gymnastics and denial that people engage in to avoid being called racist. As a licensed psychologist and professional counselor, and as a Black woman, I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations about race. I've created spaces where people can think about who they are as racial beings, where they can examine their biases and see how these actually show up in their everyday lives. And this hasn't always been easy. In fact, it is very difficult to discuss race, much less begin to fix it, especially at an individual level. Why is this so hard? Why is it so difficult? There are many reasons, but one, because typically we don't have the same definition of what racism is. When I say racism, I mean behaviors that disadvantage communities of color as a direct result of the power and the privilege that is associated with the majority's race. When we discuss racism or avoid discussing racism, there's also another reason: fear. Fear of being called racist, fear of having our behaviors grouped with other people who have committed more overt acts of racism, fear of getting something wrong, fear of offending someone. And then we tend to respond to this fear in one or two ways. One, we just completely avoid the topic altogether. Or we conclude that race does not matter, and that we are colorblind, and that we simply see each other as a part of the human race, and that's it. Well, both of these responses reinforce racism because they fail to acknowledge the problem, and they fail to acknowledge our role in actually maintaining the problem. When we avoid the topic of racism, we miss the role that we may play in the problem. We end up looking everywhere outside of ourselves for solutions. We look to policy, we look to institutions, we look to systems, and we think if we can just change these things, racism will disappear. But we ignore the fact that individuals make up systems. Sure, there is significant policy work, there is significant structural and systemic work that absolutely has to be done to address racism. However, at the root of all of these are people, us, individuals. There is no path, no sustainable path to racial justice that does not include a human. The problem is in the individual, our tendencies to minimize the issue of race and ignore our roles in racism. The problem includes the individual, and so the solution must include work on the individual and with the individual. I believe the solution is introspection. What is introspection? So introspection is the practice of thinking about who we are. It includes our thoughts, thinking about our actions, our behaviors, our biases. It includes us asking ourselves questions like, who am I? Who am I as a racial being? What does race have to do with this particular situation? What assumptions am I bringing with me to this situation? Where did they come from? How might they be wrong? Introspection includes challenging our thoughts and examining our thoughts. Now, introspection does not include avoiding being called a racist. It does not include showing up at multiple protests. It does not include serving on multiple diversity committees. And introspection is not inherently found in our politics, be they conservative or liberal. Introspection includes examining, challenging our thoughts, but also working to understand the impact, the significant impact that these have on other people. This impact could be the difference between life and death for people of color. This impact can be psychological. We've all seen the impact of stereotypes and biases and racism. We've seen it in the news. I've seen it in counseling sessions, and I've seen it in my own life. So, a couple of years ago, I was getting ready for an evening meeting. I was at home, and I was in a hurry. I grabbed my keys, my bag, my phone. I turned on my house alarm, and I ran out the door. Well, about 5 minutes into my trip, I received a phone call, and it was a security company. But before I could answer it, I was receiving another call, and it was my son, Chandler. And while I was receiving that call, it hit me. Oh my goodness, Chandler. My 15-year-old son at that time was in the house when I turned on the alarm. My heart was beating out of my chest as I turned the car around and rushed home. By the time I was able to get him back on the phone, I could actually hear the alarm blaring in the background. I began to worry, would the security company go ahead and dispatch the police? And would they beat me there? Luckily, I got home, rushed through the door to find that Chandler had been able to disable our alarm. The security company had canceled their call for police. A sense of relief washed over me. By the time I was able to get my thoughts together, I asked Chandler, what would you have done had the police come? And he said, "Run." I would have run. Listen, this stopped me in my tracks. Why would he feel the need to run? Because a world that lacks introspection is a world full of fear for everyone. Imagine a world in which the presence of police did not result in anxiety, that it resulted in people feeling safe, that the presence actually bridged racial divides. Imagine a world in which students of color were disciplined fairly. Imagine a world where there were no racial wealth disparities and wealth gaps. Imagine a community in which we all embrace our individual and collective roles in racism, where rather than running from being called racist, that we would stop, think about ourselves, and examine our thoughts. We know that we've achieved introspection when we can simply identify one thing. It could be a perception, a perspective, an attitude, or a behavior that we bring to a situation that might be influenced by either our race or the race of someone else. We know that we've achieved introspection when we can actually stop in the moment, as close to the moment as possible, and tackle the automatic thoughts that we experience from the biases and the racism that we hold. And guess what? We all have automatic thoughts. We all have biases. So one night, this was when I was teaching on campus. I was on my way to teach a multicultural psychology course. It was dark. The streets were empty, and I could hear someone walking behind me. Well, I began to get this distinct feeling that someone was following me. I walked faster, they walked faster. I veered to the left, they followed. In my periphery, I could tell that the individual was wearing a trench coat, that they appeared to be white, and they appeared to be male, which then just led me to think, what are his intentions? And might I be in harm's way? I walked faster and faster until I got inside of my building. I hurried over to the elevators and pushed the buttons very quickly. By this time, I was convinced that harm was inevitable as the person in the trench coat approached slowly. The elevator doors opened. I walked in quickly. I was scared. As the elevator doors closed, the white man in the trench coat that was following me, simply walked past the elevator, smiled, took off his book bag, and entered his classroom that was on that same floor. Why was I so scared? What was I thinking? What about this person led me to believe that they were going to cause me harm? Where did those thoughts come from? What assumptions did I make? And how was I wrong? I had to challenge myself and give myself permission to ask very tough questions. But this is not only my work. This is the work we all must do. We all have to be willing to ask ourselves tough questions. Yes, We have to understand that we are imperfect. We also understand that this work is difficult. It is very uncomfortable, and it can be quite messy. But we can't back away. We still have to confront the racial biases and the automatic thoughts that come from those, and we all have them. You know, in order to fix racism, we must look inward. If we have not engaged in introspection, we are unaware of the fact that we are actually maintaining the very thing we're fighting against. In addition to looking inward to examine our thoughts, we have to look outward to better understand others. Our introspection must be paired with other people's lived truths, their lives, their realities. We absolutely have to engage with and listen to people. You have to engage with and listen to people that do not look like you, who are often left out, communities of color. Only then can we begin to build empathy. I want to live in a world where my son, children of color, and all children don't fear being misinterpreted because of the color of their skin. When I first started this talk, I asked the question, what is the one thing no one wants to be called? And while it's highly likely that that answer has not changed in 15 minutes, I encourage you to do 3 things. 1, engage with the answer rather than trying to escape from it. To reflect on your biases with focus rather than fear. And lastly, to continue to challenge yourself and to give yourself permission to look inward. Thank you.